Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on worry and anxiety. I'm Trevor with OJJDP's and I'm joined by my colleague, Eileen Lafergie. Before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on OJJDP's YouTube page and Multimedia channel. Closed captioning will be provided in the Multimedia panel. For optimal audio, please consider using the Call Me At feature, which is located under the mute or unmute button. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties throughout this webinar, please feel free to reach out to myself or, again, my colleague Eileen Lafergie. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, but please feel free to type your question in the chat, again, with context, so that way we can refer back. A certificate of attendance will also be available at the end of this event. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Michelle Sipple.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Sorry, I'm having a bit of technical difficulty with my camera, but as usual, we forge on and get through this. Again, my name is Michelle Sipple, and I'm the program coordinator for SHIFT here at the Innocent Justice Foundation. The Innocent Justice Foundation The Innocent Justice Foundation was founded in 2007, and we are funded by OJJDP. We're here to support ICAC task force teams and their affiliates and hope that we can provide some tips for them to mitigate their stress. Throughout our relationship, we have understood the heavy burden that law enforcement officers have to face, and we want to provide them with a space where they can have some tools to mitigate that stress and normalize asking for help. Today's webinar is part 3 of our trauma series, and we'll be discussing worry and anxiety. I will now turn it over to our amazing trainers, Carol and Dave. They're here to introduce themselves, and I will be in the chat if you have any questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Carol Bruska. For those of you who have joined us on the previous sections of this webinar series, you've already been introduced to me, but for those of you who haven't, I will give a brief introduction. So I am the embedded mental health provider for the New Mexico Attorney General's Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. So what that means is I get to meet individually and as a group with the people that are working on the task force, not the victims, but the people that are working on the task force, to give them support. And many of the things that we talk about in our webinars are things that I encourage those task force members to use in their own lives. And they tell me that they report back that they do feel like there's been some positive results. I also work with victims of domestic violence, and I also work with victims of sexual assault. So I get to understand trauma from many, many different sides. I am licensed marriage and family therapist, and right now in the process of getting a doctoral degree in law and policy so I can help impact mental health law. So I'm so glad to be here today, glad that we can present again with my wonderful partner, Dave. He and I have a great time together, and I'm so looking forward to working with him today. Here you go, Dave.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you all for being here. As Carol said, my name is Dave Terry. I'm a 26-year veteran of law enforcement. I spent the first 12 years working as a special agent in the state of Pennsylvania for the Attorney General's office, and I've spent the last 14 years working for the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office in Cleveland, Ohio, where I serve as the statewide commander of the Ohio Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. So one of 61 commanders statewide, or nationwide, I should say, with the sole responsibility of investigating, prosecuting internet crimes against children. So I have about 18 years of experience when it comes to worrying and being anxious. And so I'm hoping to kind of impart some of what I've learned, because obviously, you know, it's very easy to worry. It's very easy to be anxious, especially in our line of work, and in any line of work where you're dealing with the public and keeping people safe. So Like Carol said, thrilled to be here, and hopefully you get something out of this class today, this webinar. One of the things we always start with at the Innocent Justice Foundation is just the idea that, we want to normalize this discussion that we're going to have. Whatever the topic is, whatever the training is, what you're feeling is normal. And so we really want to spend a lot of time, kind of smashing that stigma, if you will, just understanding that, we're all worried, we're all anxious, we're all going through things. When I started working with the Innocent Justice Foundation, they were helpful in making me realize that we were all in the same boat, that we needed a mental health and wellness program, that we needed to be able to come together with a mental health professional individually, but also as a group to be able to verbalize and talk about some of the things that we were dealing with. And in doing that, it allowed us to sort of, get outside of our shell and really talk about the things that were affecting us personally to make us better as an individual, but then also as a team. Yeah, you're muted, Carol, I think.
You mean people can't read my lips? So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss the characteristics of worry and compare that to the characteristics of anxiety, because although sometimes they sound similar, they are actually very different, and we want to make sure that people have a good understanding of both. And then we're also going to talk about triggers and how to recognize the triggers, and then what happens when we get triggered. So if I get triggered and it causes worry, or if I get triggered and it causes anxiety, if I understand the trigger, then I can stop that cycle right from the beginning and then deal with the trigger ahead of time. Then we're also going to explore the ways to manage and cope with anxiety and worry. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's just get started.
So what are the differences, right? I mean, there's days where I'm worried, there's days where I'm anxious. I mean, in some respects, those sound like they're the same thing. And in some ways they may be, right? But obviously when we talk about worry, we're thinking about something that either has happened, may happen, may never happen. How often do we think to ourselves that we're worried about something, right? Or we worry about something that ultimately never happens. And so maybe it is a passing thought. Maybe it's something that we can take care of right away. On the positive side, does it help us problem solve? Sure. We worry about something, and then we think about, 5 or 6 scenarios that may be causing us to worry, and we work through those. And maybe none of them ever come to fruition, but maybe 1 or 2 of them do, and we've figured out a way to problem solve that. As opposed to anxiety, where it comes on unexpectedly. We all of a sudden become anxious. I get anxious for a number of different reasons, a lot of them that I really have no control over. And that's where it can be, chronic, it can be persistent. I mean, there have been some days where I have felt anxious the entire day, or, I'll wake up the next day and I'll suddenly feel anxious, and that in itself will cause me to worry as well. So, and in some cases, we're so paralyzed by this idea of anxiety that we can't make decisions. We talk about decision fatigue, and there's been days where someone has asked me a simple question and I haven't been able to give them an answer. And I realize that I'm in that state of anxiety, and that I'm spending so much time there that, I need to basically disconnect myself from that anxiety and figure out some things that I can do to return to that normal state. So, that's essentially what we're going to talk about today.
So I love this Irma Bombeck quote. Worry is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it never gets you anywhere. So when I think about worry, really for me, it's like worry is the precursor to making me do something, right? Worry is the little poke that says, hey, you need to do something, you need to do something. Worry isn't the end result. At least we hope it's not the end result. We hope it's just the beginning that will take us to the next step where we need to be. So it is. It's like a rocking chair. If you go and you go and you go and you go, you never get anywhere. So it says here, worry is a chain of thoughts and images negatively affect-laden and relatively uncontrollable. It represents an attempt to engage in mental problem solving on an issue whose outcome is uncertain but contains possibility of one or more negative outcomes. So that's the behavioral research and therapy fancy schmancy definition of worry. When again, when I think about worry, I think of the situation where something is bothering us and we get this thought and worry, and then if we act on it, the worry goes away. So it's, to me, worry is like the little bit of, hey, do something, and then if I do it, the worry goes away and everything is fine. If I don't, if I just think worry is the end result, then I'm going to focus on worry and it's going to go on and on and on. So making sure that I recognize worry is not the end result, worry is the first step, and it's the step that's supposed to remind me that I need to do something about this particular issue. So if I'm worried about my grades at school and I just sit there in worry, I'm not going to get better grades. They're not going to be good at all because I'm just sitting there worrying and not doing anything. If I recognize I'm worrying about grades and so consequently I think, oh, then I need to study harder, then that worry was the trigger for me to do something to help myself. So if you can think of worry as the messenger saying, hey, look at this, what are you going to do? Worry, you can actually have a better feeling about worry. It's more like a messenger than like the end result. So our brain triggers us to think about a potential problem, and we can take the steps to address it or get stuck in rumination. And that's what I was talking about earlier. If you can think of a situation where you worried about something and where you did something about it and the worry went away, that's very different from getting stuck in rumination. The problem sometimes is we worry about things that we can't really have any control over. So if I'm worried about climate change, I can do my own little piece of that climate change worry, but I can't really address it on a larger scale because I'm not the one that makes the decisions. If I'm worried about the war in Ukraine, I can do my part, what I feel like would be helpful, but I certainly cannot go stop the war. So sometimes when we have a worry, what makes the worry turn into rumination and getting stuck in rumination is because we can't really do anything about it. So we can do our own little part, but we have to also accept that even if we are worrying about it, it's not making that situation any better. So if I'm worried about the war in Ukraine, and I know that what I would like to do is do something to support the children there that are struggling, and I take that step, and that's all I can do, then I need to accept I've done everything I can, and now there's nothing more that I personally can do, and that can help me not get stuck in rumination. Certainly, it's not going to take away my concern. It's not going to take away my desire to support or help, but I can really feel confident that I've done everything within my own power, given that I'm one individual, to help the situation, and then I can move on from there. So we can do that with any type of worry. If it's a worry that we have control over that situation, we can actually go beyond the steps of worry and then take it to resolution. If worry is something that we're worrying about is something very large that we cannot influence or impact on a larger scale, then we can think about what are the actual things that I can do, and then once I've done those things, then I need to try to let it go because I can't go beyond that.
And what I think is interesting about that is that, we think about the steps we can take to address the problem. And then in a lot of cases, we don't take those steps right away, right? I mean, when we think about why we worry, I mean, there are a number of reasons, why that may be the case. and I think a lot of times people feel like, that this idea of worrying is accomplishing something, right? When in reality, it's really not. I had a day off a few weeks ago with my wife, and we were driving somewhere, and she realized that there was a problem at her work. She's in education. And so rather than call the school right away, I watched as she sat there for about a half hour and worried about it. And she verbalized the things she was worried about. She talked about all the things that could be going wrong. And then ultimately she just said, I got to call on this right now, or it's going to eat at me, or I'm going to worry about it all weekend. And then she called and realized within 30 seconds that everything was fine. But it was interesting to see her as kind of she talked herself through this process of worrying, only to then, essentially she could have saved herself 20 minutes um, if she had just in that point of time picked up the phone and made this phone call. So, um, I think in a lot of cases it's, if I worry, I'll never be surprised. Or, I don't want to be blindsided by bad news. Um, so I'm going to worry to preempt any sort of, disappointment that may occur. But obviously it's impossible to avoid upsets. And how much are we suffering, while we're fearing this worry or this future that may never happen? Um, Sometimes people say it's safer if we worry. If we think about all the things that could go wrong, then, when none of them go wrong, we're we're that much better off. Um, it shows we care, right? Sometimes we worry because we think that it shows that we care, um, or that it says something good about us, right? I only worry because I care. I hear that a lot from people. But we often turn that saying around and think if I didn't worry, it would mean I don't care, right? And we obviously know that that's not the case. We need to distinguish between this idea of caring about a situation, including doing everything in our power to help it turn out well, and this idea of worrying needlessly and fruitlessly about it. So, we can ask family members if they'd rather we worry or show we care in other ways, but nonetheless, we need to do something about it. Sometimes people will say it keeps us motivated, right? Worrying motivates me to come up with a problem or come up with a solution to why I'm worrying. Um, or it helps us solve problems. Okay, we might tell ourselves that worrying about a problem is how we find solutions to that problem. However, there's a flip side to that, right? And that's that extreme worrying is likely to interfere with that idea of problem solving. So we need to be aware of the difference between productive problems solving and this idea that we're just spinning our wheels and constantly worrying and worrying and worrying about things that we can't change. So what can we do about worry? Obviously, we're all going to worry. We're not, going to tell you today that this webinar is designed to help you never worry ever again. So I think what's important is to pay attention to what triggered it in the first place. As I try and worry less, what helps me is to really focus on what it is that started that in the first place. Again, this idea that my wife had an issue at work, she makes that phone call right away, she suddenly erases all that worry. We've been conditioned to say, what if when we think about worry. But what if instead we said, okay, now what? Right? Like now what am I going to do about this right now that's going to reduce or take away that worry completely? And I think when we focus on what triggered it in the first place, that then helps us move past it that much quicker. Same with our beliefs that are related to that worry, right? Why do we believe this, or what has conditioned us to worry in the first place? And I think the nice thing that we can do is, and I know we don't like to think about this, right? But this idea of uncertainty, right? Embracing this uncertainty as part of our life. That, okay, maybe something did happen, right? Maybe it's out of our control. Maybe there is something that we can do about it. But oftentimes something has happened, we can address it and we can move on, but there's always going to be that part of uncertainty in our life that we may not be able to get over. Staying in the moment is very helpful, right? Like, this thing happened. I'm going to stay in the moment. I'm going to continue on with what I'm doing. I'm going to do what I can to, remove that worry and that anxiety. But, I'm going to live in the moment. I'm going to be me. And, if I've done something, if I've made a decision, I'm going to live with it. And then obviously we can also, accept that we might be afraid sometimes. I think when we talk about mental health and wellness, it's important to talk about being afraid, being nervous, worrying at times. We're afraid of what has happened. We're afraid of what may happen, right? And I think that speaks again to that idea of the uncertainty that regardless of how much we worry or regardless of how anxious we are, not going to change ultimately, how other people see the situation or how the situation ultimately unfolds. And so, we talked a little bit about worry and this idea of anxiety as well. And again, we've all been anxious, right? Because we've all had an uncomfortable feeling of unease, especially, I think about it from a law enforcement standpoint. Every case that we work has to do with internet crimes against children. And so my last 18 of my 26-year law enforcement career has been nothing but this somewhat feeling of, uneasiness of, am I missing something? Are we doing what we can? Have we saved, a child? Are there other children out there that we're not aware of? Are we missing offenders? That creates a sort of a constant state of anxiousness or anxiety. And, in some cases that, makes me feel nervous at times. It makes me feel restless. I like to be busy, but there are some days where I feel that anxiety and that restlessness, what I believe are me being busy, are truly more of an idea of feeling that anxiety and understanding or trying to understand where it's coming from. It obviously leads to trouble concentrating. As I said earlier, there are times where it's tough to make decisions. There are times where it's tough to focus on one task over another. And then just this idea of impending doom, right? I've tried to really step back as I think about what triggers, certain things. A lot of times it has to do with the job or from a personal standpoint, issues that I might be having at home with my wife or my kids or finances, right? And this idea that, we look at social media so much. Right? I mean, how often are you being anxious from the time you spend on social media, right? Social media making you anxious. The news is making you anxious, right? Because society is giving us this idea that there is this impending doom out there, that there is this, culture and constant problems that we're dealing with out in the real world that then heightens that idea of anxiety. And our anxiety does not come from thinking about the future, but from wanting to control it, right? I mean, we constantly want to be, the captains of our ship. We want to be able to steer where we're going without any sort of rough waves or icebergs. And then, unfortunately, that's just not realistic.
So there are different types of anxiety. We might not realize that we can do this deep dive into anxiety, and that's not just one kind of anxiety. Generalized anxiety disorder really is a disorder that's in the DSM, the book of diagnoses, and people can be diagnosed with this. So generalized anxiety disorder is really anxiety in general. It's not specified about one type of thing. It's when we individually might feel that it's related to one thing or another, but typically anxiety would be that we have, maybe we have some anxiety around work. Maybe we're anxious because things are happening at work, or maybe we're anxious around coming up decision we have to make. Maybe we're anxious just in general. Everything makes us kind of anxious. It makes us anxious to think about going to work. It makes us anxious to think about organizing a vacation. It makes us anxious to think about what we're going to do in our future. So that's kind of the generalized anxiety. Obviously, this is called generalized. That's what it means. Separation anxiety, this might be something that when you've heard this in context, it might be related to puppies or dogs often experience separation anxiety, and children often experience separation anxiety. And that's when they are connected to their caregiver, whether it's a dog and the person or the child. It certainly could be an adult as well, but there's this close connection with someone, and when that someone is out of the picture, then there's a lot of anxiety. So I'm actually fostering a dog right now who has terrible separation anxiety, and I had to leave him last week for about 3 hours and came home, and he destroyed multiple things. And he did that not because he was being bad, but because of the separation anxiety. And so if you have a child who has separation anxiety, it might manifest itself as them acting out because they don't have the words to say, I'm feeling very anxious. I'm feeling nervous and anxious that my person, the person that my support person, is not here. So they might end up crying, they might end up acting out, they might end up doing things that under normal circumstances they wouldn't do at all. But because their person is not around and they've got that anxiety around related to being away from that person, they might do things that we would not otherwise think about. So, and obviously not all children experience separation anxiety, although many children in particular cycles in their life do experience that. But if there's something that's ongoing, really intense separation anxiety that lasts for a long period of time, that's definitely something that you want to get addressed, because if your child has separation anxiety with you, you can't just stop doing never leaving the house because that's not necessarily going to make it better. But if your child is experiencing separation anxiety, or sometimes it might be a parent, an elderly parent that might experience separation anxiety. So they might be nervous if they're living with you, they might be nervous if you have to leave, or if their spouse has to leave. So separation anxiety really is when you are separated from that person who you consider a support. It makes people very anxious and nervous and needing to get that person back again. Social anxiety is something that many people experience. It's in social settings. So maybe you have a social anxiety when you're trying to speak to people in public, or maybe it's you know there's an office party coming up for the holidays, and the thought of going to that office party is very nerve-wracking to you because you know you might have to talk to people and come up with some small talk, and that makes you feel uncomfortable. And then the more you think about it, the more you think about it, the more you think about it, it gets worse and worse and worse. And there's definitely other situations where social anxiety comes up. So it can also come up in situations where you have to be at work, or other situations where you might have to encounter people. So sometimes people have social anxiety to the point where even going to the grocery store and the potential for having to talk to the people and meet with people, or starting a new job, the social anxiety could be so great because then it's meeting new people and trying to learn that new job at the same time, and the hope or the concern that people won't like you. All of that stuff can be tied up in social anxiety. And then panic disorder is another type of anxiety, and typically panic disorder, people talk about having a panic attack, and sometimes they report that feels like a heart attack. So the anxiety gets to be so intense that it can cause physical symptoms in your body. So you might have a heart that's racing, you might have cold, clammy hands, you might just be immobile by the anxiety and the panic. Now, certainly if you're feeling like your heart is racing and you're having clammy hands, you want to make sure you get to the physical doctor, because although it might seem like panic disorder, we don't know for sure if it's a panic disorder or heart issues, and you don't want to just wait on it and assume that it's one or the other. So that's why many people go to the hospital and then they're concerned they're having a heart attack when actually it's a panic attack instead. But you want to address it as if it's something physical until somebody says, don't worry about it. You know, we can give you some medication to help with that. Because there is medication that people can take for anxiety disorders, and they can be very, very helpful. Now, lastly is obsessive compulsive disorder. This, again, is a type of anxiety. And with obsessive compulsive disorder, people are obsessed with doing something and they feel compulsion to do it repeatedly. So you might know somebody that has to turn a light off and on before they leave the room. Or I had a neighbor once who, every time he would leave the house, he would lock the door, he would unlock the door, he would lock the door, he would open it up, and it's a certain number of times he would do that, and every single time that's what he did. But he needed that to feel secure. He needed that to decrease his anxiety. Other people have different obsessive compulsive traits, so they might do something like wash their hands repeatedly, or sometimes they can do, you know, there's the door locking, there's the washing hands, there's all sorts of things that start out as something small but then become something giant, and then they can be to the point where they can kind of take over your life. If you've got multiple different obsessions that you have to deal with before you can even leave the house, that can really be difficult to manage. So there are three components of anxiety. There's the emotional component, the physiological component, and the cognitive component. The emotional component is really fear, sadness, or irritation. So when we're feeling anxious, oftentimes we just think really worried. That's what comes to mind for us is worried, nervous. But there is also really fear, sadness, and irritation. So sometimes people that are anxious are just really irritated. And we don't really recognize that initially as, oh, that's anxiety. We might just think that they're just being grumpy, that something else is going on. But oftentimes anxiety does manifest itself as irritability. So if you are feeling irritable yourself, maybe do a check and say, am I actually feeling anxious about something? So I know for me that, true confessions here, for me, when I get really anxious about something, so when I know that I've got a big paper due or a test due or something else that I've got to do, my go-to is to become irritable. And people around me know, oh, she must be anxious because she's getting irritable. So that's definitely the way that anxiety manifests for me, more so than worry and sadness. So from a physiological standpoint, you might have an upset stomach or your heart might race. And sometimes people get an upset stomach because the anxiety causes them to go into fight, flight, freeze. And if they go into fight, flight, freeze and they're in the freeze mode, that can cause the stomach upset and the stomach issues. And then also, again, the heart racing is when we're feeling very nervous about something and that anxiety gets to us, and our heart starts beating faster and faster as a way to, because we're feeling so anxious. But again, if you're having that, make sure you get to the doctors just to verify whether it's anxiety or something, a medical issue. And then from the cognitive standpoint, we tell ourselves all sorts of things when we're anxious. I'm a failure. I'll never be able to do this. It's not going to work out. All of those things, the negative things that we tell ourselves, which don't help the anxiety. It's not like that's result. If we say, well, I'm a failure, then we're no longer anxious. That's not how it works at all. It just makes the anxiety worse, because then it's like, well, I have to go make this speech and I know I'm a failure, and so I'll probably mess up and forget what I was supposed to say. And so then we plant that seed, and then the more we think about it, the worse it gets, and the worse it gets, then the greater our anxiety is, and so on and so on. So trying to recognize the symptoms right away. If you're feeling irritable, if you're having your heart racing, if you're feeling like I'm just a failure, I can't do this, then take a step back and say, this sounds like anxiety. What do I need to do to address this right away so it doesn't take on a life of its own?
And I think that's where, when we talked earlier about normalizing the discussion, I think that's where it's so very important that we talk to other people, right? These three components that Carol just talked about, okay? Emotional, physiological and cognitive. How much of our worry and our anxiety can be reduced by talking to somebody else about what we're feeling, right? If we are being worried and we're anxious internally, like, and I talk to somebody about what I'm thinking, how I'm feeling, or what physical symptoms I'm having, is some of that mitigated by what someone else may tell me or someone else's analysis or idea of a situation, right? Because, when we talk about the ABCs of it all, this idea that, this alarm goes off in our brain and our brain's going to control a lot of what we feel and how we think and how we respond to things. And, but this idea that the brain thinks that this is something worth sounding that anxiety alarm about, right, in the first place. And then what is our belief about this alarm, right? Why are we anxious? Why are we worried about something? Is this something that I can handle on one side, or am I, creating a catastrophe out of it? Okay, so what we believe about our anxiety is sort of the second part of that. And then, thirdly, how are we going to cope with what's making us feel anxious, right? Are we going to cope in an unproductive way where, we might turn to drinking, we might, when I get anxious, I eat ice cream, right? I'm not much of a drinker. I'm more of an ice cream or a sweets guy. So, there's been more nights than I care to admit, and I guess it depends on how you look at it, right? I'm eating a lot of ice cream, okay? Now, my wife will tell you that I should be doing something productive when I'm anxious, like going to the gym, taking a walk, finding a creative outlet for that anxiety. And so a lot of times it's how we cope with it, right? I mean, we're going to be anxious, but if we find a productive outlet for that anxiety as we work through it, then oftentimes, we're going to find a benefit to it at the end.
I'm muting myself again. When we talk about the cycle of anxiety, what exactly are we talking about? It's the cycle of anxiety starts with that feeling of anxiousness, and then that leads to us potentially avoiding the issue. So if I'm worried about, maybe I'm worried about school, and again, because that's from the top of my brain these days. So I'm worried about school, and so I'm anxious, and then my first inclination is to say, okay, I'm going to avoid it. I don't want to even think about it. I'm just not going to address it. I would rather not even have to deal with that as opposed to thinking about it, worrying that I'm a failure, worrying that it's not going to work out. So I'll just pretend that it's something that I can avoid. When in reality, most of the time, the things that make us anxious are not things that we can just avoid. So it could be, for instance, again, if somebody else has an anxious thought about something coming up in their life, they have to have they're having an assessment at work, or they're having the quarterly evaluation at work. And so they're having anxiety about that, but you can't really just avoid it. You can't just say, well, I just won't deal with it then, because you have to, your boss isn't going to say, oh, you don't feel like dealing with it? Okay, no problem. We'll just skip the evaluation for this quarter. No, it's something that you have to deal with anyway. So avoidance doesn't work, but we try to go there. It's like, well, when my boss says, what days do I have available, I'll just give them a day way off in the future, and then maybe I'll try to call in sick that day. And that avoidance doesn't work. It actually just makes things worse. And so we might have a short-term relief from the anxiety because we're thinking, phew, I don't have to deal with that today. I don't have to deal with that next week. And now my boss is on vacation, so I can avoid that evaluation. But again, like it says here, that's short-term relief. It's not something that's going to be long-term. It's not something that's going to resolve the issue. It's just something that is prolonging it and actually can make everything worse. Because instead of just addressing it head on and getting it over with, we drag it out and drag it out and drag it out, which makes everything worse. And then by that time, by the time we are through that anxiety, then we have to address it. So at some point I have to say, okay, my supervisor says that I have to meet with him. I already called in sick one time. He was on vacation. I have to do it. I just got to get it over. And then what do we see is we get the long-term growth. We get the growth of saying, okay, I made this mountain out of a molehill. Had I just sat down with my boss, regardless of what the outcome was, whether he gave me a bad evaluation or a good evaluation, I spent weeks and weeks and weeks worrying about it, and when I could have just gotten it over with. So my long-term growth teaches me that not putting it off and just hitting it head on is honestly going to be better for my anxiety. It's not going to necessarily change the results. If I'm going to get a good evaluation, it's going to be the same whether I wait or not. And if I'm getting a bad evaluation, it's going to be the same whether I wait or not. But I'm not carrying that anxiety, which can potentially cripple me and take over my life. I'm saying, I'm going to address it. I'm going to do it. And the things that I notice, if I begin to procrastinate and it's because of anxiety, the sooner I just say, I know where this goes. I know when I procrastinate, when I'm feeling anxious, it just gets worse. So let's just get it over with and then deal with the results, and then at least I can move on. So that's what the cycle of anxiety is, and if we can close that loop and then get back to the, okay, I'm going to just deal with this head on, it can potentially decrease our anxiety and have us less anxious overall.
Yeah, and I think back to my early days of law enforcement, and I think about the veterans that I worked with at the time. I was a young guy fresh out of college, and these were guys who had gone through that and come out to that point of long-term growth. It's nice to work around people that have kind of gone through that already, have had that experience of understanding what anxiety looks like, the relief from it, but then coming out and recognizing what it really does for you from a growth standpoint. So certainly there are a lot of benefits to anxiety as well. And oftentimes we talk about that it can be a strength, not just for you, but for other people, for understanding other people, right? Maybe it increases our attunement to others. Okay, we've talked about this idea that we're going to talk to others about the things that worry us, that make us anxious, that are affecting us from a mental health and wellness standpoint. We've been doing that for years here at the task force because we recognize that everybody is anxious, everybody is worrying at times, everyone is struggling with the things that are affecting them from a work or even a personal standpoint. So it's been helpful to understand or to use anxiety to help us understand what people are going through. It helps us understand our own feelings, right? And in doing that, it helps us understand or better understand the feelings of others. Maybe it increases compassion. We've talked a lot about compassion fatigue at the Innocent Justice Foundation, right? And in the work that we do as law enforcement, it's easy to feel fatigued about what others are going through. Okay. But when we're anxious about things and when we focus on what is making us anxious, oftentimes we can relate that to what other people are going through. Or if I watch somebody at work that is anxious and they talk about what's making them anxious, maybe in the future that reminds me of what their anxiety was, and it helps me understand a little better about how they process and how they deal with it. And then this idea that it pushes us to perform, right? I mean, there's days where I have no anxiety, and in some of those days, I feel relaxed. Now, when I feel relaxed at work, sometimes I'm not as productive as I might be where, I have 100 things to do, and I'm anxious about certain things. And it's sort of this tidal wave that is pushing me forward that helps me, perform a little better than I might if I'm not anxious about anything.
And so when we look at coping skills, how do we help ourselves? We know that anxiety is more than likely going to be inevitable under some circumstances. I don't know anybody that doesn't experience anxiety. I just know some people that are better at handling it than other people. So what do we do when we're experiencing anxiety or worry that can actually help us get through that? So one of the things is repetitive phrases or a mantra. And this phrase can be something that just that you come up with, because there might be some that you can find that people in general will say, but it works best if it's genuine for yourself. So maybe it's something like, well, for me, the one that I always use is "this too will pass." This too will pass, because it reminds me that whatever this is temporary. There's nothing in life that's going to be so permanent. Even if it turns out poorly, it's nothing that's going to be permanent. So there will potentially be a way to make things better later on. So my repetitive phrase is "this too will pass." Some other people might have the phrase of "it's going to be okay." Somebody else might have the phrase of "I believe in myself," or whatever else it is that works for you, that might make you feel better, that's going to make you feel calm. And my suggestion to you is, when you're doing this, do some deep breathing at the same time. Doing that deep breathing is going to actually help you relax by bringing down your heart rate. It's going to help by getting that oxygen to your brain. So take a deep breath in, and when I do, I say, take a deep breath in, I say, "this too will pass," and then I release. This too will pass. And then after a couple times of saying that and doing that deep breathing, I do notice a sense in my body that I am feeling a little bit better. It's not that the whole worry is over, or the whole anxiety is over. It's just that I'm feeling a little bit better, less worried, less anxious when I've done that. And then the other thing that you could try is called the cooked noodle exercise. And this sounds kind of funny, but just say "cooked noodle," and then imagine all of the tension leaving your body as if a light switch is turned on. So think about saying "cooked noodle" and imagining yourself as that cooked noodle, and you just kind of flop over. That worry, that tension that keeps you upright and scared is gone, and you're like a cooked noodle, and everything is better. So that's it, and it's a silly one, so it's one that's useful. Whoops, hang on a second. My dog is scratching at the door, and he's making a lot of noise, so I'm going to let him out. So hang on a second.
So, and to Carol's point there, I mean, I can't tell you how important breathing is, right? I mean, I think about the times that I'm most anxious. I realize that I'm holding my breath. There have been plenty of days where, like, I've let out a sigh and realized, unconsciously, that I've been holding my breath. And so, breathing is just so important, right? We take that for granted, but to be able to, breathe correctly, it helps with focus, it helps to reduce that anxiety. And that point about body cues, right? I mean, there's days where I'll come home and I'll realize that my neck is sore and my shoulders are sore, and that I've not been sitting correctly. And, again, all signs that, that may be anxiety that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, that's my foster dog. He has separation anxiety, and he also has separation anxiety from the other dogs. So if he's not with the other dogs, he's got separation anxiety. But so again, like Dave was talking about with the breathing and the focusing, if you can just take that deep breath in, focus on the outcome you want, focus on what will make the situation better, focus on the steps you can take, because it's not helpful to us to continue to focus on our anxiety or worry. And then identify if it's anxiety or worry. So that's an important piece of it. Is this anxiety? So this is just that feeling of tension that I'm experiencing, or is this worry, which then I could be doing something else. So the worry would say, this is an indicator you need to address this, but the anxiety is there's an overwhelming feeling that you need to handle something, and you're not necessarily handling it, or you're not handling it in a way that's helpful. And then pay attention, so important. Pay attention to your bodily cues. So if your body is telling you that there's tension in your shoulders, then just relax those shoulders. If your body is telling you that you've got tension in your stomach, then do some twists to kind of get that going. If you've got some tension in your legs, maybe what's going on is that you've got the tension is coming from being in fight mode. But really pay attention to your body, because the sooner you can address that, then the sooner that you can feel better. So we'll constantly check in, particularly if it's a situation that causes you stress. Check in, see what you need to do, and then move on from there. And then some other things that really work well is progressive muscle relaxation. So I like the progressive muscle relaxation I like to use is from an app called Insight Timer, and I think I talk about Insight Timer on almost every training that I do. They have progressive muscle relaxation meditations that are 5 minutes all the way up to 30 minutes, probably 45 minutes. But what progressive muscle relaxation is, it's just kind of like you do a body scan and you tighten the muscle and then you relax it. And then you tighten and you relax. And you do that starting from typically from your feet all the way up. And what that does is it highlights where you're holding your tension, and then it focuses you on letting that tension go. So doing that on a regular basis is a good way to check in with yourself to see where am I holding that anxiety, where am I holding that tension, and then what can I do to make things better. Meditation, again, is something that we talk about all the time. Meditation is useful because we can focus, and if we're doing a mindfulness meditation, we're focusing on our breath at the moment. We're focusing on a single pointed idea, and that's going to help us because it takes our brain away from everything else. If we are completely focused on one thing, we can't be focused on the things that are causing us anxiety and worry. So meditation is wonderful. Mindfulness, keeping that focus going, is wonderful. Grounding, we talk about grounding techniques. Again, that's something that we highlight in many of our webinars, and we're going to actually, Dave's going to talk to us about that in a minute, but grounding exercises are great to do because it brings you back into the here and now, and being back in the here and now will help you so that you can not have to think about those worries. And then challenge the irrational thoughts. And I talk to my clients about this kind of thing all the time. When they're having irrational thoughts, I say, what is the likelihood of that actually happening? So if you're worried, I said, you know, what's the worst case scenario that's going to happen? Is somebody going to die? Okay, so nobody's going to die, so the worst case scenario is not going to happen. What's the worst thing that can happen? If it's related to your job, worst case scenario would be I'm going to get fired. But what's the likelihood of that happening? Or what's the likelihood of you messing up so much? You know, if we take it to the extreme to try to figure out the worst case scenario and challenge those irrational thoughts, the more we do that, the more we think, oh, wow, I was really making this into a big deal when it's not such a big deal. So really taking the time to challenge the irrational thoughts and thinking about what's the likelihood of this happening and worst case scenario, what could happen, that's going to make the big difference for you coming out of that worry and saying, yeah, I can handle it. It's not as bad as I thought. I thought that it was a giant thing, and now when I look at it from a different perspective, I can see it's just something that's an inconvenience or something that I'm worried about that I actually can address. And then the last thing on this list for coping skills is imagery. And when we're talking about imagery, what we're talking about is imagining something in your brain that makes you feel calm. So imagery can be, I imagine I'm sitting on a beach and I can hear the water. Imagery can be, I remember spending time with my son and we were having a great time, and so I recreate that in my mind and that imagery. Or I could just use imagery of things like my tension is, imagine something that like maybe a balloon. So my tension, I'm putting my tension in the balloon and it's going to float away. Or maybe my imagery is I'm putting my tension at the ocean and it's going to be carried away by the ocean. So have some sort of imagery that you can use to really make the difference in getting through that difficulty, whether it's worry, whether it's anxiety, so that you can imagine that anxiety or worry leaving. Or maybe you imagine that the worry or anxiety is like the clouds in the sky, and they're here, and then they move on, and then they're gone. So whatever kind of imagery works for you, you can imagine that becomes your worry, and your worry is carried away, or it's in the sky and it's blown away, or maybe it's like a dandelion, and when they turn to seed, and you can blow that worry away just like you could dandelion seeds. So anything that you could use yourself to make those, to imagine having that anxiety or worry leave, can be really supportive and helpful.
Yeah, and I think
Oh, I'm sorry, Dave. I thought you were going to. Oh.
no, I thought the grounding exercise was in there.
I thought it was too.
Carol talked a little bit. I mean, I think that the interesting thing with all of these is it really forces us to, kind of take that break, right? I mean, if you're like me, the day is not long enough. We're doing, work's going to be there the next day, but we're in this mindset that we've got to get it done and we've got to stay focused, and there's things that we're worrying about. There's things that make us anxious. But all these skills here, they really force us to, take that break, sit back for a second. Even when we talk about something like as simple as breathing, right? Or we realize that we need to relax our muscles and kind of take that break or be grounded. You can meditate at work without the physical act or the idea of going somewhere and physically meditating, right? I mean, there's plenty of times where, I'll sit back and I'll just kind of give myself a minute or two, right, to meditate in my chair, to kind of look out the window. Or we've talked a lot about this idea of like this 20-20-20 rule, where, we'll find something 20 feet away and we'll stare at it, for 20 seconds. And we'll do that every 20 minutes during the course of the day, right? I mean, in some respects, that's meditation. Being more mindful about, what's going on or what's forcing us or causing us to be anxious at times. One of these grounding exercises that we often do, speaks to just acknowledging things that are around you, right? So, like, can you acknowledge 5 things that are around you right now, right? Physically, sit back and think about things that are around you. I'm in this wellness room here at our task force office, right? And I can find 5 things that are around me. Perhaps I can find 4 things that I can touch, right? That there is texture to, right? The chair that I'm sitting in, the table that is in front of me, the water bottle that is next to me. Okay. 3 things that I can hear. I'll acknowledge 3 things that I can hear, like the hum of this little refrigerator. I can hear people that are outside the door. I can hear the air conditioner, the hum of the air conditioner above me, right? 2 things that I can smell. Okay, we have a essential oil diffuser in here, and I can smell the citrus smell coming out of that. I can smell the cologne that I put on early this morning. Or I catch the smell of somebody walking by with their lunch. And then 1 thing that I can taste, right? Whether that's like the water or the mint that I had earlier, I can still taste some of that as well. But this idea that I'm going to, focus on those 5 things around me, those 4 things that I can touch, those 3 things that I can hear, the 2 things I can smell, and the 1 thing I can taste, help me become grounded. And that's one of the many exercises that you can do to, really force yourself sometimes to be grounded or to be more mindful about the day.
Dave, and I use that grounding technique myself, and I talk to lots of my clients about using that grounding technique because it's so effective, and you can do it without anywhere you are. You can do it, and you don't need any special tools, and you don't need anything but your body and your 5 senses. So it's something, and people don't even realize what you're doing. If you're in a meeting and you start to feel anxious and you look around and you kind of count the 5 things, the 4 things, the 3 things, people aren't going to know what you're doing. They're not going to know that you're doing a grounding activity that is actually benefiting you and making you be able to stay in the moment and more calm. So when we look at managing anxiety, something that really important is to understand the anxiety. What is causing me the anxiety? What's the root? So if I'm feeling more irritable than normal, and if that's not typically my go-to to feel irritable, I need to do kind of an inventory. Is something bothering me? Is there some deadline that I'm dreading? Is there some project that I'm putting off? Is there something that's making me feel nervous or anxious? And so I can understand the anxiety and then go from there. I could say, okay, I understand the anxiety now is related to a big presentation that I have to give that I'm not feeling very confident about, and I know it's a big crowd, so what do I need to do to address that anxiety so it'll go away so I can feel better? And so one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to take steps to remain calm. And again, that might be doing some grounding before I go to do that presentation. It might be that I just practice some deep breaths. I might use imagery. Imagining myself giving that lecture or that presentation and it going perfectly well. So all of those things I can use to get me back to a state of calm. Then identify and challenge anxious thoughts. So I could say, what's the likelihood of me forgetting everything I'm going to talk about during this presentation? Because I know the information so well, I could say it in my sleep. So the likelihood of me forgetting everything that is in my presentation is very, very unlikely. It's not likely at all. And then I want to face my fears, and I say, okay, maybe one of the things that I can do is I can go to the location where I'm going to be presenting and just stand there and imagine what it's going to be like when the room is full of people. So I'm going to face that fear. Because if I don't do that and I then say, oops, sorry, something came up, I'm not available, or I make another excuse and avoid it, it's not going to take away that anxiety. It's just going to prolong it, and it might make it even larger than it would have been otherwise. So facing my fear, getting up there saying, okay, this is something that makes me anxious. And on the other side of that, when we are able to face our fears, it can actually help us build our resilience and our self-esteem and our confidence. Because then we can look back and think, wow, I remember that presentation and I was so nervous because there was 300 people in the room and I thought that I was going to be a failure. And look, I did it. So now I feel more confident that if that thing comes again, I will be able to succeed. So facing your fears head on can be very helpful, and it can build our self-confidence and self-esteem to make it easier the next time. And then problem solve. So if I'm worried about this presentation or this lecture that I'm giving, how can I make it less worrisome? Well, I could go into the lecture hall ahead of time and stand there and imagine what it's going to be like. I could ask somebody that I care about to come sit there in the audience in the front row. So if I'm feeling nervous, I can use them as my touchstone. Maybe one of the things I do is I actually have something in my pocket that makes me feel calm. So maybe it's a rock that my son gave me when he was a little boy, and I can put my hand in my pocket and I could feel that sense of, oh, I know that I love him and he loves me, and that makes me feel calm. Or I remember one time when I was feeling really nervous, I put my grandmother's perfume on, the same perfume she used to wear. And so it made me feel like she was with me. So figuring out what I can do to decrease the anxiety in a situation where I have to face that anyway. So again, maybe if this was the evaluation at work and you're feeling nervous because you don't know what's going to happen, or you don't ever feel like you do well during work evaluations, what are the things that you can do to make yourself problem solve for that? So maybe I'm going to go in with some questions from my supervisor so that I will know at least what I want to ask. Because if there are things that that I know that I haven't done well, or if there's things that I want to point out that I have done well, I've got that list taken care of. So I'm going to problem solve that anxiety. Maybe I'm going to start out by telling my boss I'm feeling really nervous about evaluations because they always make me anxious, and I just wanted to let you know that. So what are the things that I can do to make myself be as prepared as possible to decrease the anxiety? How can I problem solve that? Because sometimes we just can't avoid the anxious situation. We have to face our fears, and if we're going to be involved in that anxious situation, what do we do to manage it the best that we can.
And it should start with you. I mean, obviously we talk about this a lot, but you know, if you're anxious, if you're worrying, if you're dealing with something, a lot of times focus on yourself. Okay, we have a tendency to worry about others. I have a tendency to worry about, you know, the people that I supervise. I worry about, you know, the people that are above me as well. I worry about my family, but you know, oftentimes what we're dealing with is something we've got to focus on. So, you know, focus on your body, focus on your brain, focus on how you're feeling, right? Focus on, you know, physical things that you can change. I'm not as good at this for eating lots of fruits and vegetables. I'm getting better, but I mean, I can tell you that when I eat healthy, I feel much better about how I'm managing my anxiety, my nervousness, the things that I'm dealing with, right? I feel better physically, I feel better mentally. There's a proven benefit, obviously, to eating healthy foods, taking care of yourself, um, getting physical activity, right? There's days where I'll come home and I'll be anxious, and my wife will say, "Why don't you go for a walk?" And I'll go outside and I'll get some fresh air. And it's amazing just in that, you know, 15 or 20 minutes that I'm walking around the neighborhood, how much better I feel about myself. Um, do I get as much sleep as I'd like? No, but when I do get a good night's sleep, when I'm able to go to bed early, you know, and wake up refreshed, I mean, that does wonders for your anxiety as well, as does drinking lots of water. I'm trying to drink more water. It's easy to, you know, gravitate to something that's like a sugary drink or alcohol, or to eat something that, you know, is in that comfort food category, and it makes us feel good for a brief period of time. But oftentimes the physical limitations of it or the adverse effects of eating something like that catch up with us later, as opposed to, you know, staying hydrated, staying physically fit, you know, and eating well. What's not on here, which should be, is this idea that we're going to put down our electronics, right? From somebody who has spent a lifetime working with the internet and social media, I think one of the best ways we can manage our anxiety is to simply turn our phones off, turn our devices off, turn our TVs off. Um, People will ask me what I think the worst thing that was ever created was, and hands down, social media. But it's amazing when I put that device away, when I spend time with family, when I talk to my wife, when we have some quality time together where we're not in front of our screens, that oftentimes is what helps me manage my anxiety better than anything.
And then you want to think about what specifically can I actually control? Like I was saying previously, there's some things that we have no control over. We cannot control if I'm going to be driving to visit family. I cannot control if it's going to be snowy on the road. I cannot control whether what someone else is going to do in my life. If one of my big things that I always worry about, my go-to worry, because I think it's kind of a common thing as a parent, is I worry about my son. And not that there's any specific worry, I just worry about him in general. And what I know is he's actually doing fine. He's smart enough. He's doing a great job of living his life. He's got it down. But when I think about worrying about him, what good is that doing? I'm certainly not going to tell him all the worry, because that can actually shake his confidence and think that I don't have confidence in his ability to manage his life. So I'm not going to do that. And so then I just keep the worry to myself. And is that helping? No, it's not. So focus on what I can control. I have no control over his actions, his behaviors, anything. So it's not useful for me to worry or have anxiety about him. Yes, if he was going to be doing something that out of the ordinary, or if he was having surgery, or if there was something going on in his life, anxiety or worry would be more appropriate in that situation. But we're just worrying in general for the sake of worrying is not going to help him or me. Another situation, maybe it's I'm worried about work. Well, what pieces of that can I control? And the only things that I can control is that I show up, I do my job the best I can, and then I try to leave the situation better than when I got there. Then that's all I can control, right? I can't control the weather. I can't control other people. I can't control. There's so few things that I really can control. And if I can let go of the worry and anxiety around the things that I can't control, there's just a few things to worry about. you know, am I doing the things that I need to do? Is my life going the direction that I want it to go, given the circumstances that I can control? And then practicing gratitude is so important. Practicing gratitude takes us out of our head for a moment, and it puts our head in a place of, what are the things that I can feel grateful for? What are the things that I appreciate? What are the things that bring me happiness? I was doing a training yesterday, and one of the women was in the training was saying, you know, she said, I was thinking this morning on my drive that it was so difficult to get into the car because it was cold outside and I had to wait for it to warm up. She said, and then I thought about all the people that are sleeping on the streets at night. So, you know, we think about something and we think that's a big deal, and then we think, wait a minute, we are so fortunate that we actually have a house to sleep in, and that we get to get into this car that we own, and it's going to get us somewhere, instead of sleeping on the street and then having to take the bus somewhere to get to our next direction. So having that gratitude, reminding ourselves of the things that we can be grateful for, and doing that on a regular basis, that will help us feel appreciative, and that will help take us out of our worry and our anxiety. And then reach out for support. You know, we've talked a lot over our trainings about how resilience works, and resilience works because we have supports and we use them. So if we have somebody that we know has our back, then share the worry or the anxiety with them. Most of the time, the people that we care for, or that we care about, or that care for us, they're going to give us some sound advice. They're not going to say, yes, that's a legitimate worry, maybe you should worry more. Right? Most people don't do that, unless it's a circumstance where really that worry is founded. But most of the time, they will walk us through the thoughts that we're having in our head. They'll help us come up with a reasonable suggestion, or they will help us understand that our thoughts are irrational, and we just need to figure out how to get through that. So making sure that you're reaching out for supports. If you don't have a support family member that you can just talk to about the issue, then maybe go to someone. You know, if I'm worried about something at work, I can go to HR and I can say, I'm really worried about my performance evaluation. Or if I'm really worried about the weather for my drive to go somewhere, I can look at the weather station and see what the weather's supposed to be like. So reach out for support doesn't necessarily mean going to see a therapist. It doesn't necessarily mean getting support only from friends and family. It can be going to somebody who has more information on the topic that you're worried about than you have. So it's a great way to just kind of put that into somebody else's hands that has more skill, more knowledge, that is more prepared to give us an answer. And so, you know, some other things that we can do to manage our worry or anxiety. Practice self-compassion and self-care. And this is something that is so important for all of us, particularly if we have a very busy life and we have a tendency to take care of others, but not ourselves. So are we doing what we need to do to allow ourselves to be human? Or when we make a mistake, do we say, oh my gosh, nobody else would make that mistake, I'm such an idiot, I'm such a loser? Or do we say, wow, I made a mistake there, but you know, I know other people in their lives have made mistakes, and I can get through this. And then what are you doing for self-care? Are you taking time out for yourself to just relax, or to meditate, or to go for a bike ride, or any of those things that you do just for yourself? How often are you doing that? Because we need to replenish our own cup. If we are giving and giving and giving in our job, no matter what type of job it is, if we're giving 100% of ourselves every day, we need to fill that cup back up again. And self-compassion and self-care, caring for ourselves and having compassion for ourselves, is the way to do that. Another thing to do is to take a warm bath. So a warm bath can be so relaxing and rewarding, and it can help you forget what your worries are. So if you can get into a nice warm bath and you've got some candles going and you've got some nice smell going, and then you can just close your eyes and imagine you're in the ocean, or imagine that all of your troubles are floating away, or that, you know, something along that line, that can be very helpful, because it gives you, again, that break. It doesn't necessarily take the worry or anxiety away permanently, but it will give you a break from the worry and anxiety, and that will help you potentially come up with a better solution. And then thinking about getting creative. What are the things that I can do that are creative that will take my brain away from that worry and anxiety and putting it somewhere more productive? So maybe I can paint. Maybe I enjoy that and I can just let myself go and get caught up in the painting and then forget about the things I'm worried about. Or maybe I can write. I can write a journal. I can write a short story about somebody that was in a situation that had a worry like me. But just being able to write out those feelings and reading them on paper, sometimes that makes them feel like they're so much smaller. When we've got them in our head, they feel giant, like they're going to take over our life. And then we write them down and then we vocalize that and we think, wow, okay, that's not really as bad as I've imagined it to be. And I think I might have a solution. Cooking is something, again, that's really useful. When Dave was talking about the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cooking is a great way to get that do a grounding activity, because when we're in the kitchen, there's definitely 5 things we can see, 4 we can hear, 3 we can touch, and so on. And at that same time, cooking can be such a positively stimulating activity. So we are smelling the good smells of whatever it is we're cooking. We're enjoying the process of creating something. We are potentially thinking about how we can share what we've cooked with somebody else. So that's going to help bring in those supports. So if you enjoy cooking, it's a wonderful way to de-stress, stop worrying. And again, it might not take away the worry forever or the anxiety forever, but it will definitely take it away for a long enough time that we can have a little break. And then dancing is huge because it moves our body, which gets the cortisol out. And it's difficult to be upset if we're dancing and moving our body and singing a song at the same time. It's harder to be upset. And if we're just focused on shaking off all of that anxiety and that worry and through our dance, that's going to make us feel better too. So getting our body moving, being creative, doing the things that we enjoy, all of those are wonderful ways that we can manage worry and anxiety. And, you know, managing worry and anxiety can also look like volunteering. The reason that this is useful is because, again, we're getting out of ourselves. So if I am focused on feeding people at a shelter, then I'm listening to them and hearing them talk and asking them questions about their own experience. That's going to take me out of my own head for a little bit. It's going to be a wonderful way to forget about my troubles and then give somebody else some of my energy and time. Spending time with pets can be great, although my day-to-day with pets, not so great. But it's, you know, part of that is because I'm volunteering as a foster parent for this dog. But what we do know is if you have a pet and you can spend time with that pet, it can actually decrease your sense of anxiety and your blood pressure, and it can make you feel more calm. The research around that's done with the dogs, but I'm sure if you have a lizard or a bird or a cat that brings you that level of calm, it will work the same. So spending time with your pets, just hanging out, the other day I was sitting there watching TV and I knew I had to get up, but I just didn't want to get up because all 5 dogs were laying on top of me in parts and everybody was stacked and I was so cozy and they were all so content. And I thought, oh, this is a moment that I want to remember because that's one of those positive moments, spending time with my pet. And then humor and comedy, Dave, do you have any thoughts on humor and comedy? Is that something that do you use that as a worry anxiety trick?
Yeah, I never like when people ask me the question, how do you do what you do? But one of the things I say, obviously, besides the satisfaction of it all, is this: that we try to have fun with it, really. And I hate saying we have fun with internet crimes against children, but what I mean is that simply, you have to find some humor and comedy and fun in the job that you're doing, right? Hopefully you're doing a job that you love. That's a big part of your anxiety and worry as well. But if you're at a job that you love doing, that brings you satisfaction, you should have some fun with it, regardless of what that is. So, in law enforcement, we use a lot of dark humor. We use a lot of comedy. We joke around at times when it's necessary or appropriate, right? We're not doing that out in the public. We're not doing that out on the streets, but we have kind of a sanctuary, if you will, in our office where we know that we trust the people that we work with and we can be ourselves, we can open up, we can find some humor and comedy and in some things that really, help us manage and lessen that anxiety that we're all feeling at times.
And so another thing that you can do, and I suggest this, and I've done this myself, is plan worry time. So it's a way of managing what we're doing and how we're going to deal with that worry. So I've done this myself, and like I said, I've told clients to do it. So how much time do you think that you need to worry? So if I think this problem is going to take 20 minutes of worry, I'm going to focus on only this worry for the next 20 minutes. And then I'm going to put it away, and I'm not going to let myself think about it. So I'm going to just bathe and wallow in that worry for the next 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and then it's gone. So planning the worry time, whether it's planning it on a daily basis, a weekly, monthly basis, whatever you need to do, can be very, very effective in making sure that we are addressing what we need to in a way that's helpful. And then we want to write down our worries, because once we have them written down, we get them out of our brain, and it makes things even easier for us to manage, because then it's a tangible thing. So write down your worries and then either burn them or let them blow away, or address them and then cross them off one at a time. But doing that will take it out of our brain and take some of that weight off. And then challenge your worries. Is this really something that's useful to be worrying about? If I'm worrying about something I have no control over, what is the point of that? Could I use that brain energy and brain space to do something instead? Could I use that brain energy and brain space to read a book that I've wanted to read, or to call a friend, or to make plans for dinner? How can I use that time and effort that I'm putting into worrying and do something else with it?
And that's similar to this idea that, we're going to embrace the worst case scenario, right? Think about the worst possible thing that could happen when we're feeling anxious or when we're worried about something, and then working to offset it, or thinking about ways that we can essentially defeat it, right? Perhaps we're going to fake it, right? And what I mean by that is that, maybe we're not as happy as we should be or could be, but can we, sort of force ourselves to be happy, right? It's amazing if you can, force yourself to smile in a bad situation, what that can do for you in some cases to help you start to, return to that normal state or that happy state that you're in, that's going to lessen that idea of worry and anxiety. What I think is most important on here, and I talked about this a second ago, is this idea of just enjoying your work, right? Loving what you do, being organized. If you come in my office, it is extremely organized to the point where, papers are 90-degree angles, the desk is clean. I actively work to keep my office organized because number one, it helps me be more efficient. But number two, when I'm organized, I'm less anxious. I worry about less things. I can see everything right in front of me, right? For those of you that have these inboxes that have just thousands and thousands of emails, whether they're read or unread, right? I mean, that makes me worried. That makes me anxious, right? So to have an inbox that has, 5 or 6 emails, and then the rest of them are all organized in, other subfolders, again, does wonders for my worry and anxiety. So, again, going along with having fun is this idea of being organized and having a workspace, right? Take stock of your own workspace, right? Can you make it a better experience at work, knowing that you've got to be there 8 or 10 hours a day? It should be a place that you look forward to coming to.
And then certainly, if none of these ideas are helping, seek out some professional help. Mental health providers, whether that's a personal one that you find outside of your work, whether that's someone that's through your employee assistance program, whether it's someone that's self-paid, go get that help if you feel like you need it. Or if there's peer support, whether that's an actual peer support unit that's part of your office, or whether it's just your own peers that you're reaching for support. Chaplaincy is always great. I know that Dave can fill us in on chaplaincy if he can.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes along with this idea of having this peer support or somebody that is there that is a resource, right? The big benefit of chaplaincy is that you have somebody that is essentially an anonymous support for you, right? Someone that's going to come in and be there for you, and provide not necessarily always a spiritual aspect, but someone that can give you that guidance or that direction that maybe you need to overcome some of those challenges.
And what are the benefits then? If we've been talking about managing the worry and anxiety, what are the benefits? And they're all right here. They really don't need much explanation. We're going to have less tension in our body. We're going to notice that our body is feeling better. We're going to have more energy because that anxiety and worry is not weighing us down. More resilience because we've been through that anxiety cycle and we know we can do it again. More clear-headed because that anxiety and worry are not taking over every space in our brain. And less angry and annoyed. If we don't have that anxiety that's making us irritable, then we're going to feel less angry and annoyed. And it's going to help us increase our positive relationships with others as we are feeling better about ourselves. So typically, people will be happier overall if they can manage their worry and anxiety. And then one way we can do that is through neuroplasticity. So we can change our unproductive habits and how our brain reacts by just changing the pathway. So if we have one habit that we're not happy about, anxiety for one, we can change that pathway of every time I think about school, I get anxious, by changing it to every time I think about school, I think about how happy I'll be when I graduate. And so every time I start to worry about school, I change that and say, and I'll be so happy that when I graduate. I change that neural pathway and I increase the positivity and the optimism, and I reduce feeling bad and negative.
And it's important to, understand that, we don't want it to overtake us, right? Because we need to realize that setbacks are going to happen. Okay, it would be great if we got from point A to point B and it was a straight line, but we recognize that that's not going to happen, right? So when we're in those valleys, when we're in those moats, or when we're climbing up that difficult hill, it's that idea that we've accomplished something that's been difficult, that we've, worried and succeeded, or we've been anxious and we've gotten out of it, that oftentimes brings us satisfaction and also that long-term growth that we talked about earlier.
So when we think about that, boats that stay in the harbor are safe, sweetheart, but that's not what they're built for. So thinking about, definitely it's safe if we don't address those anxiety issues, but what quality of life do we have then?
So I know that was a lot of information in a short time. Hopefully, we've obviously talked about characteristics of worry and anxiety. Hopefully you understand a little better some of the triggers and how you're going to recognize, worry and anxiety, and then obviously the big thing, managing and coping with that anxiety and worry that's certainly, going to come your way at some point. But again, it's all in how we deal with it.
All right, thank you so much for truly all that extremely helpful information. I know that there's a lot for us to take back and hopefully use. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Here again are our guests, Carol Briska, Dave Frater, and Michelle Sipple. And then you can reach out to us at OJJDP's NTech by email. You may also go to the OJJDP website. For upcoming events or to keep up with events like such, please feel free to go to OJJDP's website and register for their Juve Just announcements. That is a subscription in which you will get emails to be updated when events are announced. And if you have any TTA needs, training and technical assistance, please feel free to go to TTA 360, help with that in terms of getting you services that you need, We also have access to a user guide if you are new to the process. Again, this webinar has been recorded or is being recorded and will be available on OJJDP's YouTube channel and multimedia pages. And you can also connect with OJJDP on X, Facebook, YouTube, as well as their newsletter and JuveJust platforms. So thank you again so much for being here today. Bye, everyone.